In the story of creation, found in the Old Testament book of Genesis, we read where Adam and Eve had partaken of the forbidden fruit, something which had been specifically denied to them by God. You could say, I got this from someone in the congregation sent me a list of church jokes or jokes. You could say that Adam and Eve were the first people to not read and therefore not agree to the apple terms and conditions. Knowing that God is searching for them, Adam and Eve attempt to hide. It's a scene perhaps reminiscent of many of our childhoods when we knew we had done something right. I won't speak for you guys. When I knew I had done something wrong and ran and hid somewhere, hoping that my searching parents would never find me. It never worked, but that kind of thing. Well, God, of course, finds them. For after all, where can we possibly go to hide from God? And God asks them, why are you hiding? And you remember the response that Adam gave? Because I was afraid. Fear is so basic to who we are as human beings. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. There seems to be no limit to our fears. In a Peanuts cartoon, Charlie Brown goes and gives Lucy, the psychiatrist, asking for his 5 cents worth of psychiatric help. She proceeds to pinpoint or try to pinpoint whatever particular fear he is facing. Perhaps, Lucy says, you have hypengyophobia, which is the fear of responsibility. But Charlie Brown says, no. Well, maybe you have oilurophobia, which is the fear of cats. No. Well, maybe you have climacophobia, Lucy says, almost in exasperation, which is the fear of staircases. My dog has that. And Charlie Brown says, no. Well, Lucy, thoroughly exasperated with Charlie Brown, finally says, well, maybe you've got pantophobia, which is the fear of everything. And Charlie Brown exclaims, yes, that's it. Sometimes we feel like we're afraid of everything. What sort of things are you afraid of? Spiders. Heights. Who uses a nightlight? Fear of the dark. Who has a flashlight within arm's reach of them? Always, almost. Mark, yeah. Fear of in-laws. Fear of failure. Fear of all manner of things. We're afraid of people. Afraid of life. Afraid of death. Afraid of anything and everything. Fear. Every person, every Christian must learn how to deal with our fears. Even Paul, the apostle from the New Testament, the founder of many churches 2,000 years ago, the incredible, we think, fearless leader of the early church, even Paul had to fight his own fears. He fell flat on his face in Athens. He says he did exactly what he did not want to do. In his own eyes, he failed. He wrote of his arrival in Corinth, for when we came into that Macedonia, we had no rest and we were troubled on every side. Outside of us were fightings, and within us there were fears. Paul was full of fears, just like you and me. The fear of inadequacy. Fear of failing. Do you know one of the ways that I started getting over my fear of failure? By constantly failing. And then learning how to get up again. Perhaps one of the most surprising fears that people don't ever really talk about, that we don't like to address, is a fear of God. A sort of fear of God. It's the fear that God isn't really in the room with us, that God has left the building. A fear that somehow God has abandoned us, that He's left us out on a limb, high and dry or soaking wet, and He's walked away. That God is no longer with us, beside us, or even in us. The fear that in the midst of the storms of this life, because God has left, that we're going to drown. Wow. Maybe even have the fear that God is going to write us out of His will, if He hasn't already, for all the stuff that we've done. It's not actually a new idea. One of the greatest fears the ancient people had was that their God would fall asleep. Can you imagine such a thing? When the prophets of Baal could not get their gods to send fire down upon the top of Mount Carmel in 1 Kings chapter 18 in the Old Testament, God's prophet Elijah taunted them, saying, maybe your God is asleep. You should yell even more to get his attention, to wake him up. But on the other hand, God's covenant people, the Jews, took great comfort in the fact that, as God said Himself, the God of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. Over and over and over and over again, the message of the Bible is, of God's word to His creation is, do not be afraid. When Abram took his family to the promised land, he feared. He was turning his back on everything he had known, his security, his family, his roots there, and he was heading towards a very unknown future. But God spoke to him, don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward will be great. When God's covenant people, the Jews, stood at the edge of the Red Sea and could see Pharaoh's chariots charging towards them on the horizon, they were filled with fear that they would all be slaughtered. And yet God's leader, Moses, said to them, stand still and don't be afraid, and see the salvation of the Lord. When the angel of the Lord came to Mary and said to her that she would bear a child, she was so afraid she trembled. And the angel said, don't be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. Don't be afraid. We must confront our fears. We pay a price, an enormous price, when we don't deal with our fears. The baby boomer generation, who are they? According to generally births from 1945 to 1965. The baby boomer generation had to live with one of the greatest ultimate fears of all, that of thermonuclear war during what was called the Cold War era. People lived in a fear that there would be a war started somewhere between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. There were even bomb drills in schools where the students were told to hide under their desk, as if that would do much in the face of a nuclear bomb. Did you know that over 500,000 bomb shelters and fallout shelters were built in the United States in a 3-year period in the early 60s during the height of the Cold War? What's one of the results of raising an entire generation of children in fear? It was my generation, the baby boomer generation, that started the drug and sex revolution in the 60s and reaching into the 70s and beyond. Now I know that those are two huge and very complex issues. But how many people growing up in that era, in that generation, thought to themselves, why not? I mean, if the world's going to end in a big flash of a nuclear bomb, why not go out with a little enjoyment? I might as well have some fun if I'm going to die anyway. Morals started to be thrown out the window, and many people became fatalistic about life. And there's Simon Peter in the boat, crossing the Lake of Galilee after a long day with the crowds that we talked about last Sunday. And now, at the end of the afternoon, Jesus has miraculously fed 10,000 plus people. He sends the disciples away in the boat to cross the lake, in order for Jesus to stay there and dismiss the crowds of people who, as John's Gospel also says, the crowds of people with this miraculous feeding of them wanted to name Jesus and make him forcibly their king. The wrong idea of what his kingship was to be. So he sends them all home. And then Jesus goes up into the hills by himself to pray, to commune with God. And now, here's Peter stepping out of the boat into the storm, maybe trying to imitate his master Jesus walking on the water. Tempestuous Peter, quick-tempered Peter, tempting the storm. Successful for a moment until the situation gets the best of him and his fear rises and he starts to sink. Over and over again in the scriptures we are told, do not be afraid. How many times? Any guesses before? Oh.
Right.
Did you read that? Any guesses how many times? 365 times, one for every day of the year. We're told by God, do not be afraid. Do you realize that? If you have fears, you're not alone. Every one of us in this room has fears. Paul, writing to the young disciple, Timothy, said, God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but of love and power and self-discipline. And once we grasp that most basic understanding, we can then go about easier dealing with our fears, confronting our fears, acknowledging that they're there, and asking for God's help. For it's his Spirit's strength and power and passion and peace that resides within us, who replaces our fears with his perfect love and peace. We are never powerless, left powerless in the midst of a storm. We have the Spirit of a living God, the same Spirit who calmed the storm several times for his disciples. We have that Spirit of God with us and in us. Can you hear God whispering in Peter's ear when he got out of the boat and started walking, and then he took his eyes off Jesus and he notices the waves and he hears the wind blowing and he starts to sink? Can you hear God whispering in Peter's ear, quit letting your imagination magnify your fears. The storm sure is furious, but I am even greater still. Harness our imaginations, which our fears tend to run away with, instead of letting our imaginations harness us. Confronting our fears, we get out of the boat and try to walk to Jesus. And we understand from Peter and all the others, and including our own lives as followers of Christ, that sometimes too much doubt can lead to sinking us. Charles Kettering was the one-time research head of General Motors. He wrote that when he wanted a problem solved in a management staff meeting, he would put a little table outside the conference room, and he had a sign on the table, and this is showing you the age of when this happened. And his sign would say, "Leave your slide rulers here." He said, if I didn't do that, invariably somebody would, in the meeting, pull out their slide rule of what we're talking about, and he'd do some calculations on the slide rule and say, "But boss, that can't be done." Can you see the other disciples in the boat there that day, in their fears? Peter, you can't do that. We don't know who it is out there on the water. It could be a ghost, it could be the devil, we don't know. God only knows what it is, but Peter, you can't do that. Have you ever tried to walk on water? It only works when there's a thin eighth of an inch layer of water over the concrete. then you almost look like you're walking on water. I tried. Sorry?
Or it's frozen.
Or it's frozen. True. I tried walking on water when I was a kid. 6 years old, 1968. Fell into a pool, couldn't walk on the water, went to the bottom, almost drowned, and that was when my parents forced us all, my fault, that we were all going to have swimming lessons come spring and summer, starting that year. Great idea. Wrong way to learn how to do it, but great idea. Walking on the water. I don't know how long Peter was walking on the water. None of us do, towards Jesus. But Peter said, Lord, if it's you, you can tell me to come and walk on the water towards you. And Jesus said, come. And he gets out. Do you see that? Peter walking on the water isn't necessarily about him walking on the water, the miracle as that is. Maybe it's that he wanted to confer that this ghost that they were afraid of on the water was actually his Lord and his Savior. Jesus can make him walk. Bless you. But a ghost will only make him wet. Peter knows, as do we, that the Lord is the one who can sustain us, even in the midst of a storm. Even when it seems like only uncertainty is swirling all around us, God will take care of us. But you know what? Faith is a risk-taking lifestyle. It's a choice that we make. Faith does not come in a perfect package. Faith is challenging. And I oftentimes find myself caught somewhere between faith and getting out of the boat and walking to Jesus, and doubts and sinking in the water myself. Peter gets caught between the wind and the waves as he's walking towards Jesus. He doubts and he starts fearing the storm and he falls beneath the waves. And it's intriguing as we take our gaze off Jesus, how quickly and how easily we can fall flat on our faces or we start to sink. And yet somewhere in that struggle that Peter had, it's intriguing that Jesus says to him when he reaches out his hand and saves him, why did you doubt? Oh, you of little faith. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you heard of him? Mm-hmm. Famous Soviet Union era author and Christian. Was the first author to alert the Western world, to the horrible realities that he was experiencing in the labor camps of Stalin. He wrote that it was only once during his long imprisonment in the labor camp that he despaired completely of life, became so discouraged that he thought about suicide. He was outdoors on a work detail. He reached the point where he no longer cared whether he lived or died. And when he had a break, he sat down, and all of a sudden there was a stranger sitting beside him. Someone, he wrote, he'd never seen before and never saw again. The stranger never said a word, but picked up a stick and drew with the stick a cross in the dirt before him. Solzhenitsyn wrote, I sat and stared at that cross for a long while. Staring at that cross, I realized that therein lies freedom. In the midst of a storm like hopefully none of us will ever know, Solzhenitsyn received new courage and the will to continue living. The storm never ended for years, but through Jesus, he found the strength to keep riding it out. And I may not know what storm of life will come into your lives this week, or what storm you may be enduring right now. I may not know what storms you've already experienced and endured, but I do know this. Even as the storm rages around us, if we listen very carefully with our hearts of faith, we will hear God's gentle voice calling to us. Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. And the storm does pass. Regardless of what happens, Jesus will never leave us, nor forsake us. God will always be with us. The psalmist wrote, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." Well, let me ask, what else are you going to do when you're afraid? What are you going to do if the TSE drops by half, 7,500 points, tomorrow? God's still going to be the same. He's still going to be with us. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. If war starts between the USA and North Korea, which I'm sure most of the world is praying will not happen, what if it does? Where else are we going to turn to? God will never leave us. He will always be the same, no matter what storm is swirling around us. If you get a bad medical report, where are you going to go? When I was a hospital chaplain in Toronto, Queen Elizabeth Hospital, chronic care facility, very similar to Freeport, I discovered early on two types of people. We were instructed to call them clients, but I refused to call them clients. Two types of people lived there. Those who had a faith in the risen Lord Jesus. And you could see the peace in their hearts in the midst of the storm of their medical condition they were facing. And those who had no faith and lived day to day in the midst of despair. Where else are we going to go if not God? He is our refuge and our hope. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker said that so many of the fears that we grapple with today are but manifestations of the one ultimate fear, and that is the fear of death. Perhaps he's right. How do we overcome that fear? That basic fear? Faith. Faith. The only antidote that exorcises the demons of fear that can haunt us and paralyze us. It's amazing. Jesus said to Peter, "Why did you doubt?" Fear had crept in. Doubt had begun to rise in his heart. And so Peter began to sink into the waves. It's the story of our life, isn't it? We know where we're safest. My mother used to tell us, don't go near the water. How many times did I listen? And then she'd say, stay on the pier. How many times did I listen? And when we're out on the lake in a boat, it's safe. It's much safer to stay in the boat, isn't it? But on occasion, we're willing to brave the storm and to walk on the water and do what others say is impossible for the glory of God. For it is by the saving grace of God that his power is at work in and through us. When we realize, though, that the wind is howling and that the rain is coming down in sheets, that the storm is raging, and we take our eyes off Jesus, that our doubts and our fears rise, even as we sink. Our faith sometimes can be fragile. And in the midst of our fragility, who holds us safe in the palm of his hand? God does. The story is told of old Bishop Warren Chandler, after whom the School of Theology at Emory University was named. As he lay on his deathbed, a friend of his asked him whether or not he was afraid. He said, please tell me frankly, do you fear crossing the river of death? And Chandler said this, quote, why? I belong to the Father who owns land on both sides of the river. In life there are storms, absolutely. But God has promised us that he will never leave us, never forsake us, no matter what. God is with us. He is our great salvation and our hope. God cares for each of us, even when we're immobilized by some fear in our lives. But there comes a time, like everything else, when we must place our fear at the foot of the cross and lean into the arms of our loving God. And then we too can echo the words of the old hymns. God will take care of you. And yes, indeed, He is our life's anchor that will always